Okay, hi learning designers. Today we're going to talk about how we go from having a great design concept that is authentic and we have a vision of how it's interdisciplinary. We thought about the big ideas and the connection to the program of study and what students really need. But now, how do you go from that big, exciting, sometimes overwhelming concept to something that works in the classroom for students? That's what we're focused on today. And there's two parts of it that can be thought of as working in parallel, being done, in fact, not even parallel because it's intersecting, but being done at the same time, working back and forth between these two steps. One of them is developing a prototype, and the other one is working through a learning design process, or an instructional design framework would be another terminology for it. On the screen here, you can see the Rockaby Schools Instructional Design Framework, which is the tool that teachers in Rockyview use to work together to flesh out their ideas for learning design. As you can see up in the top corner, they have a spot for big ideas, potential community connections. We've already had that conversation of what those things are going to be, and that's important to have done before we're moving into working this out. Essentially, the metaphor here is that of a timeline, as we think of time most often in our Western mindset, moving from time left across the screen to right. They have different lanes for you to think through your planning, experiences, which is what are the things students are going to be doing, that runs along a column here, a row here. Then scaffolding, here's the steps that students are going to need to get there. And then reflections goes along here. There's a blank lane in case you wanted to add something on your own. What I've done is work through that for our project that we're doing together right now, the Learning Designers Project, my instructional design. This is how I use that exact same concept to think through how to bring learning to our class. I organized an extra lane that I'm calling guiding questions, which run along the bottom here because I like to think about in an inquiry, what are the questions that are driving these sets of steps? As you can see, you recognize, I'll just walk us through this a little bit because I think sometimes a tangible example can help you recognize how this thinking goes. Important to note, you're seeing the finished product. This doesn't necessarily work in a linear sense, meaning I don't have to just start planning at the very beginning and work my way through. In fact, what I did is I started thinking right at the end here, what is it that we're going to make, create, or do that was authentic? You've already had that conversation. Stick that right at the end. And then in some ways, it's about thinking about working backwards. I also, in my process, worked to develop a prototype. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but just to remember that this isn't about necessarily working through it all in a linear way, working from left to right, filling in all of the columns as you go. Sometimes you're jumping between the different sections, but because it's finished now and that helps you to look at it, I'm going to talk you through what this is showing. So at the beginning, I knew we needed to think about what is interdisciplinary learning and what do students need. Then we needed to think about how do we develop an authentic concept. Then how do I think through a sequence of learning? How do I make it for everyone? And then how do I think and act like a graphic designer? Part of how I came up with knowing what this sequence of steps is that I've worked through this process so many times with teachers, but I also worked through what it would mean to do it as a website because that was the project deliverable and the poster. So I was able to develop an exemplar of both of those so that I could think about what is this going to mean for me as I work through this process. How would I do it? I didn't necessarily have a previous experience. I didn't have a previous experience building a website that represented a project design. So I needed to do that so I knew what steps I needed to support you with. And as I was building it, I come back to my timeline and keep adding things. So first thing for me is thinking through the process I go through as well as then thinking about in terms of questions, but again, not linear. Then I'm also thinking, as I'm thinking about these stages of what we're going to be doing, what are the supports that we're going to need? What are some of the community contacts that I have that I know? What are some of the resources that I can draw on? As you can see, those are listed, and some of these should be familiar because there's things we've done. Other ones are coming down the line that you haven't had a chance to do yet. I'm hoping to connect with Jillian Hickey, who's a graphic designer that I know, and have her expertise share to help us think like and act like a designer as we work to build our graphic design pieces. Okay, also important as we're thinking through this is what are the opportunities for assessment, both formative and summative, and critique and revision. So as I'm building this, I've been thinking through that. Intermediate deliverables are an important piece of that. I have 3 of them designed in this project. Checkpoints where I know I want to have everybody on the same page, be at a point where we can give specific feedback to the building of deliverables. But ongoing, I also have the D2L posts that are giving me evidence of how you're thinking and what your next steps might be. And some of these things will change as we work through the project and have been changing. Similarly, in the reflection line. So if this is all about the how we're doing it, the reflection is about why we're doing it. I wanted you to be able to develop an understanding of who you were as a designer. So how do I get you reflecting on that all along? How do we get students zooming out from the particular to what this means for them as a learner moving forward? If we never work to make a website again, what is it that you're learning about yourself through this process that you're going to be able to move forward into future learning? Often this is helpful to organize reflection around competencies or big skills from front matter of program of study if it's more discipline focused as opposed to interdisciplinary. In this case, I drew on our we're thinking and acting like designers and teachers. It's interdisciplinary in this project. Because of that, we're drawing on both the disciplines of education and design together to answer these questions. We're working truly interdisciplinary. It's hard to separate what it is that we're doing that draws from the discipline of design and what draws from the discipline of education. It's an interdisciplinary project. To that end, I drew on the design mindsets as a place to have you reflect, and then there's a deliverable associated with that when you build the designer statement. So that runs all the way through the project, and I recommend that when you think about reflection, it's a tool that you can design. Sometimes I use a sketchbook that students work through all along. Sometimes I use a bullseye target metaphor. Sometimes I have a series of blog posts that students do, but I find it helpful to have a routine for reflection that's consistent so that that's not something you have to introduce new each week, but rather it runs through the project. So we want to so my process is to work not necessarily linear, but to use the linear framework because it's helpful for a lot of people to think about how are we actually moving this step through. This level of detail is about the level of detail that I expect from you in your final deliverable. Similarly, this level of detail, I then have translated those design steps in my prototype into a little bit of a different format with a bit more explanation. Oops, sorry, we skipped out of there. It's important to note that I drew out particularly some thinking about these components that are directly in our rubric because I wanted to make that explicit. You can choose how you choose to do that, but when I thought about it, I thought I want to think through these different component parts. So I'm going to draw that out explicitly for my prototype, but it's not important to me that the format of how I've chosen to do this is how you do it. Rather, I wanted to think through how I would do it and make one way visible to show the elements of the rubric. We're going to dig deeper into the rubric. For now, the point of working through your prototype of what you're going to have students produce is for you to think about what it is that they need, right? This isn't you building your website because you're building a prototype of what you're asking students to do. I was asking you to build a website, so I built a website. And as I built the website, I could come back to here and think about, what are the things I needed to think about? So how are you going to do this? If you are in a situation where you're meeting face-to-face with people that you work with, you could choose to do it on a traditional whiteboard and use sticky notes like I did. But what I imagine in most cases, we're working asynchronously in this project. or at least we're working at a distance. You could choose to use the Adobe Connect space. There's a whiteboard tool built in there. I don't feel that tool is particularly robust. It sort of frustrates me. However, one advantage of it is you can talk to each other if you're working synchronously. So perhaps you use an Adobe Room and some other technology tool that you're working on at the same time. So you're talking with each other through Adobe Connect, and then you're using a whiteboard tool. I've put a link on our Newsweek outline of a review of 10 online whiteboards. There are pros and cons to a lot of them. They're listed there. Many of them are free, or at least have a free trial that you can sign up for. I encourage you, though, to use some sort of a whiteboard tool that will allow you to work synchronously together, or at least have it like Google Docs where you can come and revisit it. You may be able to make something like this with Google Docs, but I highly recommend the ability to move things around, to work in a timeline manner, because it's very helpful to do this work collaboratively and to conceptualize how the actual sequence of steps are going to go. So I encourage you to find a tool that works for you as a group to do that. Where this is headed is you're going to be prepared. Next week, we're going to add in some layers about assessment and technology and scaffolding, making it for diverse learner needs. So we're going to kind of be able to add to the timeline. Then on October 11th, you're going to have an opportunity to pitch where you are with your sequence of steps to your peers from other groups to get specific feedback and build on this again. And then there's an intermediate deliverable coming, as you can see up here, designed to draft 3, where you're going to submit to me a version of your whiteboard that I can provide you with feedback on, so that you can revise that in the final weeks leading up to submission. So this week, what the hope is you get the whiteboard built, you're working on the prototype at the same time. I would not recommend that one person does the prototype and somebody else does the learning design process. I think those need to be all done by everyone, so that you can, big point of working through the prototype is to understand the steps. And if somebody else if two different groups of people are doing that doesn't work. So work on that together somehow, kind of at the same time. You might do a rough think through steps, then build the prototype, then come back and add to the steps. As I say, you might first start thinking about intermediate deliverables and fleshing out, okay, what are the subcomponents of our final deliverable? It's not a linear process, but use a linear metaphor as a way to organize your thinking as you work through it. Okay, hopefully that gives you some information about this. Make it step. Have fun. Check out the rubric for LT3, which includes the prototype. The prototype is something that you're going to share at exhibition. So it's both a working process for this and a part of your final deliverable. Okay, have fun. This should be a fun part of the process. Make sure that before you move forward with this, you've already reviewed the feedback that I'm going to provide your group for the pitch that you've put in. And you should have already done the looking at exemplars piece, so that you have a really good idea of about what interdisciplinarity and authenticity is going to be assessed by in our rubric, so that you're not moving ahead with a concept that doesn't match the criteria. That's why I had a checkpoint put into place here. So before you're moving forward with thinking through how you're going to do this, I want to make sure that we've gotten to a concept that meets the criteria of and the expectation for authenticity and interdisciplinarity. Okay, sorry for the long video. Hope all is well. Bye for now.